Sure.
And the camera will follow you.
Oh, okay.
If you want to use this, you can use the document camera, but
No.
no. So I'm going
That's
to
fine.
go back there and introduce you with
Oh,
the mic. And
okay.
hopefully, is your mic on?
I don't know. Is this on? Does that work? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He said it was on.
Okay.
Yeah, red light is on.
Great.
On.
Okay.
Wait a minute.
We only just met, so. Well, we're very pleased to kick off our spring term seminar series sponsored by the Center for Transportation Studies here at Portland State University. We're very privileged to have Metro Council President David Bragdon here to kick us off. He's the first Metro Council president, and he has served on the Metro Council since 1998. And we just want to thank you for coming and look forward to a good conversation this afternoon.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much. I wanted to add a little bit to the introduction because transportation is actually one of my favorite topics and was the subject for most of my career before I actually went to Metro. I anticipate we'll probably talk a lot about Metro and urban planning today, but just wanted to go back a little bit further in terms of my work history. Actually, I'll go back a little bit to my academic history, if you call first grade academic history. But my first written assignment in first grade was called transportation, which my mother still has it someplace, but the word in very large letters loops around twice. But it was a story about trains, which has always been one of my favorite things. The last thing I did in terms of academics was also related to trains and transportation, which was my thesis in college, was about railroad deregulation and kind of the politics that went into regulation of freight transportation in our country and the Interstate Commerce Commission, and then what were some of the economic and political factors that led to deregulation of it. So that's a little bit where I come from. I, after college, worked in the transportation department at Nike, which is one of the biggest freight shippers around the world, and so a lot of my orientation is to the freight industry. So I'm happy to get into that in terms of questions and answers a bit later. I wanted to focus my remarks, though, more on my current role and the role of Metro as the Metropolitan Planning Organization and how we allocate transportation funds and how we do that in connection with local governments and how we do that in connection with our objectives from a land use planning point of view. Transportation funding being one of the main keys to making a land use plan either work or not work. So just to talk a little bit about the economics of it and the dollar figures and the impact that transportation can make, there are a couple of major areas that we focus on at Metro in terms of the criteria we use when we have federal transportation funds coming into the area, how we decide where to allocate those. Two of the major economic measures that we use and that we're using in a round of federal transportation funding coming up are how the funds reinforce industrial areas and commercial centers around the region. That's one criteria that we're really emphasizing this year. The second one is how do these investments assist in freight movement around the region and getting goods to and from market. And as you probably know, the Portland area is disproportionately dependent on trade, warehousing, and distribution. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that the public investments capitalize on that strength that we have in this region. Let me give you a couple of examples of how we're going about that. One is having what we're calling a freight mobility program, under which we've allocated about $40 million since 1992. A lot of that is federal money that we designate to particular projects specifically because of the impact that it has on freight. Examples of that would be access to the Rivergate area up in North Portland to allow goods to and from that industrial area as well as the port. So the freight mobility project is very, very important. Columbia Corridor is another example out near the airport. The Clackamas warehousing district is another one. And in all of those cases, we've made awards of federal funds because of the help that it gives to freight. We also have focused some of those on trying to separate rail and road to improve both of those modes. Freight trains have moved very much into what's called a unit train configuration. Rather than having a mixture of 100 different cars, having 100 cars of one commodity intact. In this region, that's primarily grain or mineral bulk fertilizers, like potash, soda ash being another example. The effect that has on the land use pattern is, in the past, these trains would come into the region, be broken up into 3 or 4 car lots, and then be sent to different grain elevators or different industrial plants around the region. Over the last 10 or 15 years, that practice has changed to being these unit trains of 104 cars at a time. The impact of that on the landscape is they need longer right-of-way, keeping those trains intact, and we need to minimize the number of crossings. So it's actually less land intensive in terms of these yards, many of which are redundant, but it's more linear in its layout. So the impact for us from the public side is twofold. First, there's been land that's been freed up, such as in the Pearl District or River District, where these transactions used to take place, but is now obsolete from a rail point of view. Yet, at the same time, in other parts of the system, primarily in North Portland along Columbia Boulevard, there's the need to minimize that connection, that conflict with the road network. Let me mention a couple of the other programs that we have that deal particularly with economic interest and business interests. Another is the Transportation Management Association system, where we have been funding groups of businesses around the region, whether it's in the Lloyd District or in Tualatin or the Gresham area, where we're working with businesses to provide carpool programs and other demand management sorts of techniques. All of those things, such as rideshare programs and employer assistance, those are now taking place in 7 different areas around the region. So that's another interaction that we have with the economy and with business. I want to go back to the first area that I touched on, which is how transportation investments reinforce what we call the centers of economic activity that we have all over the region. Transportation access to and from major centers is an important part of their success in terms of getting customers to retail areas, getting employees to work, and getting people around. We've put a lot of emphasis on centers in the last several years and are increasing that. And I want to give you a couple of examples of some successes there. Gresham is probably the best example. They've had light rail since 1986. And working with the city of Gresham and with TriMet, Metro has targeted investments to what's called the civic neighborhood in Gresham, as well as the historic downtown. And by investing in roads that connect to those different neighborhoods, we've unlocked the potential for private developers to come in, build housing, and build retail areas that didn't exist before. But it was those transportation investments that enabled that to happen. That's an example from the past, an example for the future, we hope, in terms of an emerging center being unlocked by transportation investment, is the improvements that we're hoping to make to Beckman Road in Wilsonville, which will enable access to what is currently has been the Damish State Hospital site, but with that Beckman Road extension can blossom into a new neighborhood of mixed uses of shopping and retail and housing. So again, we're trying to work strategically to make investments in the road network or the transit network that unlock those sorts of redevelopment and reuse of lands and the creation of great neighborhoods. Other parts of the country, as you know, don't spend their transportation dollars as strategically and without as much thought to the impact that it has on the landscape. The result is a lot of development that happens almost inadvertently in more of a sprawling sort of a layout. In the end, the transportation game is really about money and where money gets spent. Federal transportations flow through Metro as the Metropolitan Planning Organization, and what we try to do is to do that in a very strategic way and choose the places where we're spending it to get the most benefit, whether it's the industrial development, as I talked about, or the residential and mixed-use development, such as what can occur at Damisch. In the next few months, you'll be reading about some of the decisions that we'll be making, and I hope that you'll follow that process as a great case study. And you should judge us by whether we live up to the ideals that we're talking about here in terms of trying to be strategic with that money. This fall, there's $53 million from the federal government that will flow into this region. And there are jurisdictions all over the region that are clamoring. Everybody, especially with the gas tax situation not having increased here in Oregon, all of the local jurisdictions, we deal with 24 different cities around the region, are all going to be clamoring for part of that $53 million. Frankly, in the past, a lot of the time that money was distributed in somewhat mysterious sorts of ways, very politically, a lot of sort of subjective factors. And this time, we're trying to make those awards with the very criteria that I just talked about. Is it an investment that's going to create jobs? Is it an investment that's going to create a great place to be, whether a great place to live or shop? Is it going to advance our goals of having a good community to live in and work in? So each time we decide to spend one of those dollars this fall, I hope you and others will be watching and judging whether we make those decisions well and make sure that we're making those decisions in a way that's consistent with economic development and community development. There's going to be a lot of public hearings about this, and I hope it'll be covered in the newspaper so that you'll be watching and judging us by that. So I was asked to come in and talk about that decision-making, the impact on the economy, and so I've tried to sketch some of the criteria by which we do it, just as an introduction. I think it would probably be the most useful. You all come from a variety of backgrounds and interests and disciplines within the school here, so I'd like to finish my introductory comments and then just have the discussion, have your questions, and follow up on anything that I have said or maybe left out. So why don't I open up to your questions and discussion at this point. Yes?
$53 million that you just mentioned, what funds are those again? Is that from T21 or something?
That's right. The question was the funds that I just mentioned that I'm kind of urging you to follow as a case study over the next several months are federal funds under the T21 Transportation Equity Act for the 21st century. And the background on that is also an interesting case study, more of a political science case study than anything else, probably. The federal transportation funds are reauthorized every 6 years on a cycle that Congress goes through. And in, I believe it was 1991, it was the early 1990s, Senator Moynihan from New York, who just passed away actually a couple weeks ago, took a very creative and new approach to how federal funds could be used. And that was in the development of a bill in the early 1990s that was called ICE-T, which was the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act. I believe it was of 1991, in which the federal governments put these funds into a variety of different pots that could be used more flexibly at the local level. And some of those pots were designated specifically for projects that relate to improving the air quality, for example. That's congestion mitigation air quality pots. Other pots were called related to community development. Others related to enhancements to existing facilities or historic facilities. That transferred a lot of discretion to local levels and regional levels across the country, which made it a real test for different parts of the country as to how they were going to use that flexibility. In the past, a greater proportion of the federal funds had been doled out according to formulas that were set in the law. And under this new system, there was a bit more discretion at the regional level. That trend continued with the reauthorization of ICE-T into what's now in effect, which is T21, the Transportation Equity Act, allowing us to have that discretion. My own personal view is that we didn't make the best possible use of it the first several rounds. that a lot of the time it was the transportation professionals who continued doing business the way it had been done and didn't take advantage of all the flexibility that came under the federal law. The criteria that I talked about in my remarks, it is an attempt for us to use that flexibility in a more creative way. The bill now itself, the whole system is up for reauthorization this year in Washington. Earl Blumenauer and others are pretty active in working on that. Yes, ma'am.
I believe that the airport light rail line was the first example of. I believe that the light rail line the airport light rail line was the first example of a public-private partnership investment, and I was wondering if Metro is involved in other public-private partnerships to kind of boost the development-oriented transportation investments that you've been talking about.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the airport light rail. It does get talked about as a public-private partnership, and I don't technically see it that way, in that the private part of that was a private vendor who built the line in exchange for certain public goods. It just wasn't necessarily in exchange for a contract to build something. Bechtel was the private contractor in that case, and what they got in exchange for building the line, which they did on time and within a certain budget, using public money, though, what they got in exchange were development rights to acreage around the airport, which they teamed up with a development team on. So they were given something of a particular value, and in exchange for being given the rights to something of a particular value, they built a particular product, or a particular project. So it's just a different way of doing the transaction. I think it's a creative and positive one that recognizes the development that the project itself unlocks, and it links those two in a creative way. But in terms of being a partnership where both parties are taking a risk or both parties are putting capital in, it was not that. But I think it's a great example of creative financing. In terms of other examples where we're working with private sector vendors to do that, that's definitely the preeminent one. There are similar models in terms of toll road vendors building toll roads, I think in Southern California and elsewhere, where there's revenue sharing agreements where the private contractor has a construction role. I don't know of any other really good examples up here in Oregon right now. Certainly the streetcar, which is here, was financed in part by local improvement district by the adjoining property owners. It's a different sort of thing, but it's similar in that those benefiting most directly and the link with development pay for the construction. Yes, sir, in the back.
How cooperative, or what is the relationship between Metro and the railroads, or how cooperative have they been on projects?
That's a question that you can go back 120 years and talk about what's the relationship between railroads and government in this country, and it can be a problematic one in that a lot of course, railroads in this country are privately owned, and private investors have put the money into that. So there's often a concern on their part that while they have capital needs and they would like, in some instances, they would like to have access to government support in terms of capital funding. On the other hand, they want to run their own business in a private sense, which they do fairly successfully, at least in the western United States, where you have two railroads that are among the most profitable in the country, and certainly by global standards are very, very efficient in hauling freight. I think over the last several years, the relationship has gotten a whole lot better because the railroads see that access to some public capital can be beneficial to them, particularly in metropolitan urban areas where the capital demands of railroad operations are very high. So I would say that the relationship has gotten better. The Port of Portland is probably the lead public agency in terms of its dealings with the railroads. And I can give you a couple of examples there where the Port of Portland and either Burlington Northern or Union Pacific, as the case may be, have both put money into projects. The North Y project up at Rivergate, which allows access to Terminal 6, the port fronted the costs, which was public money. Burlington Northern is paying that back over time with a charge every time that they use the facility. So it was something that the public sector in that case could make a good business case to the railroad, that they could show to their stockholders and say, yes, we did get some public financing, but it makes a good business case for us. So I think that's probably the best model. When you get to passenger service where it doesn't make money, the railroads, of course, aren't going to do that on their own, and are often, they don't want to accept public money if it's going to require them, it's going to obligate them to do something that's going to make them lose money in some other way. So it's always a negotiation. Yes.
Thanks for coming today. I know the value there you're talking about in focusing on freight and supporting the marketplace around the region, but I'm sure there are some citizens that are really concerned more about their commuting issues or transit improvements so they can have more options, or of course bicycles are real popular now. What % would you say of these budgets that you're talking about and are going towards those other three that I mentioned, kind of commuting and transit and or congestion alleviation, transit and bicycling? And then are there examples of projects that were like with the freight you're targeting, try to make a strategic project?
Sure. In terms of other modes of transportation, it's hard to say with the budget what percentage. Certainly, the lion's share of budget in the transportation realm, when you add it all up, is going toward automotive, truck and car needs, and that the money being spent on transit or trails or bike facilities is a fraction of what's actually is being spent on the other modes. But we definitely have plans and have made investments in those other areas as well. The regional trails network, for example, is something that we're always trying to add to. Example that we've been putting a lot of work into in the last year is Fano Creek Trail out in the Beaverton area, Tualatin, to connect those sorts of areas by bike and foot. It's a smaller percentage of the budget, but we're making some progress on it. And part of these federal funds that we distribute go into those categories as well. The next round in terms of trails, and I think that's something you know a little bit, as you know a little bit about railroads too, as I recall, right? You dealt with them on I-84. But the next round in terms of trail investment is going to be the Springwater Trail out in the Milwaukee-Selwood area to connect. We've just opened this trail from the OMSI Museum out to Selwood, and the next step on that is the gap between there and the Springwater Trail, which leads all the way to Gresham. So that's about a $3 million project. $3 million is not very much in terms of highway funding, but in terms of a trail, it gets you quite a bit. And we'll build several bridges over McLaughlin and Johnson Creek and the railroad right-of-way to connect those two areas. And when that gap is filled, you'll be able to hike or bike all the way from basically the Hawthorne Bridge all the way out past Gresham. So filling in those links is really important. Yes?
You were talking about the distribution of federal funds for freight projects, things of that nature. Those funds obviously tend to go to higher capacity streets that move a lot of our traffic around the region. I'm interested to know what role Metro might be playing in terms of eventually building out our local street network. We do a lot of planning at the higher level, but it kind of stopped down at the lower level. Obviously, one of the things that we want to do is to accommodate growth within the urban growth boundary, but in order to do that, that requires transportation infrastructure all the way down to the local street level. I'm just curious if you see any kind of a role that Metro might play in either in the policy area or in the funding area to help facilitate some of that infill development.
Yeah, it is much more on a policy and technical advisory basis in terms of Metro's role vis-a-vis local streets and local facilities. I mean, you probably know that the transportation network is a patchwork of ownership and responsibility, and I think that often inhibits good policy making, actually, that certain things are owned by the state for historic reasons. The interstates, well, federal designation, those are actually state highways, but it just so happens so is Sandy Boulevard, so is Martin Luther King, and those being owned by ODOT in that case, yet really function as arterials that are important to those neighborhoods. It's often that the ownership and issues really do inhibit good policy making. And what we try to do is have everybody, all the stakeholders in the system, take kind of larger view of things and how it all fits together. With relation to local streets that are owned by cities and in some cases counties, our role has been sort of technical advice, certainly in our land use planning for new areas that are developing. We've tried to set standards and expectations for, as new areas develop, to have more of a gridded sort of street network, more connectivity being the buzzword among planners, as opposed to the type of landscape that developed much more in the 50s and 60s and 70s with a lot of cul-de-sacs which weren't connected, which then overburden the arterials. So in our land use planning that we have in our functional planning for local governments to implement, particularly in newly developed areas, it's to encourage more of for those local street networks, which are their responsibility, to encourage those to build out in a way that connects, which is a preferable type of agreement, of arrangement. The other thing we're providing to local governments is a sort of design resource through a project called the Green Streets Project, which Tom Closter at Metro and a group of folks there have developed in terms of trying to make streetscape itself more visually appealing, more functional for people as well as automobiles, and as well as kinder in terms of stormwater management. A lot of street design over the years and road design has been driven by AASHTO regulations, which are engineering standards from 40 or 50 years ago that were basically designed to maximize volume and speed of the automobiles, and so that's how transportation departments have been built streets and roads for quite a long time. With the Green Streets Manual and other design guidelines, we're trying to make an attempt to help local jurisdictions design streets in a more multimodal and kind of humane fashion. So that's available to local governments. We get a lot of requests for it from people outside the region as well. So even though you're quite right, we don't own local streets, nor do we even fund them. Most of the operations and maintenance being funded from local gas tax or the local share of the state gas tax. We do take an interest in it on that policy basis. Yeah.
You spoke about Metro allocating funding so as to, I think, as you said, unlock like the potential development potential in a certain area, and you mentioned Wilsonville. Does Metro have like a criteria list at all for local jurisdictions to go by so that they can be that area that gets unlocked, so to say?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that is when if I say the game is all about money, and if we're handing out money, then having criteria like that is really important to try to nudge people toward the policy that we want to incent. If the $53 million, that's sort of the incentive pot, they will shape their applications to meet our criteria. So that's been very important in this round, is setting those criteria up front, which we did, I think, last year, at some point during the last calendar year. So if you are interested in digging into this, this area is sort of a case study. That criteria is available. I don't know if it's available on our website, but it's certainly available through our transportation department in terms of what points get awarded for what sorts of qualities. And those applications have just been coming in over the last few months. So it's going to be very interesting to see who out there sort of has modified their applications to meet the criteria and who hasn't. Then the test is going to be, how do we implement those as we pass it out. So those criteria are available, and it'd be interesting for you to look at. Yeah. Yes.
In decreasing the amount of land use that for the freight mobility problem, it's to me it's kind of complicated. So the trains, you said they operate more. Do they operate more frequently with 104 cars? And if they do, is there a noise pollution ordinance that they have to follow?
In terms of railroad, going back to railroad freight operations again, which have changed dramatically over the last 20 years, where they're actually able to accommodate much higher volumes through the unit train concept than they could during the old sort of mix and match days of assorted freight trains. So that they are able to handle greater volumes, and it's mostly through greater equipment utilization. The example I would give you is for potash, for example, which is a fertilizer that's mined in Saskatchewan primarily, Alberta and Saskatchewan, is loaded in cars on the prairie, 104 car lots, which come to Portland, and rather than going into a yard and being shuffled, which is one of the most noise-creating activities in the railroad, of coupling and uncoupling and cars bashing into each other and engines going back and forth, rather than that happening, the trains now go straight into the terminal in Rivergate and are never uncoupled and are never put back together. They remain intact, go around a loop track, dump the potash out of the bottom onto a conveyor belt, and within 10 hours, that 104 cars is empty and is on its way back out of the region, back to Canada. So that's becoming much more the operating practice. So it's faster turnaround, better equipment utilization because they need fewer trains to handle the same amount. There's probably less noise, and it's certainly less land intensive in terms of the urban area. Grain operations are very, very similar to that as well. And the effect on the landscape in terms of land use is on both ends of the equation, that the elevators are bigger in Montana and North Dakota. Rather than having sidings every 10 miles that would load 2 or 3 cars, they'll have one large elevator at 50-mile intervals that'll do a whole train at a time. The effect on the transportation system on that end is that farmers have to truck farther to get to the railhead, but you're gaining efficiencies on the rail side. And it's a similar on this end. Yes?
I just wanted to follow up on that. I heard from Tom Cluster, though, that the case being in North Portland, where St. John's is a town center, and then you have right next Rivergate,
Right.
and that the area along the water, it's a prime area for redevelopment. Beautiful vistas and one of the few access on the river, right down to the river. However, Crawford Street or Bradford, I think, has a railroad line that goes in there,
Right.
and that you could have potentially 104 cars going very slowly,
Right.
and they unload as they go. So the first car, gets unloaded, and then you have 140 very long and very slow-going cars going by. How do you develop an area there when you have the bridge, the vistas, the park, very beautiful cathedral park there, and then you have very slow cars carrying minerals and grain? That could be a very challenge because that's a town center, and then.
Yeah, that is a big challenge. And it's similar along North Columbia Boulevard. Is that this style of operation? It's much more linear in nature as opposed to the days where it was more land intensive. Now it's long. So that's definitely a conflict in the St. John's area in particular for that particular line. So not having as many conflict either through overpasses, such as what's been done with the Esplanade right below the convention center with a pedestrian overpass, or underpasses, which we've funded elsewhere to minimize those kind of at-grade conflicts is often got to be part of the solution.
To follow up very quickly, I know Tom is very concerned about that. is Metro doing something or having conversations with the port about that?
Well, we also own some land along there that we purchased through the Green Spaces acquisition program, Willamette Cove. So those conflicts between waterfront use for industry versus recreation, I mean, we're certainly very aware of that as a property owner ourselves. And then you throw the transportation piece of it in, it does get complicated. So we do work through all of those. And certainly the St. John's truck study, I mean, that I think that's probably even a bigger issue, actually, is the trucks coming through the neighborhood. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, Professor.
We actually have a question coming in by email. I didn't mention this earlier, but we do accept questions by email. So here's the question. I can understand using transportation funds to improve our town centers, but I'm concerned that we're losing focus on the need to maintain and upgrade all of our transportation infrastructure. Portland has a number of needs to reconstruct existing facilities, and the MTIP criteria seem to be lacking in recognizing this need. Shouldn't we take care of our existing facilities before building new stuff?
As a general principle, I agree with that. That's certainly consistent with what the previous governor told the ODOT to do during his administration, that rather than building grand new things, that you need to be a good steward of the resources that you have, particularly in times when those are dwindling. When we're talking about the MTIP, which is Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Plan, that's a relatively small portion of overall transportation funds, and it's also the only pot of money, particularly in Oregon, where there's a constitutional prohibition on use of gas tax money for non-road related things. That $53 million, while it's a small proportion of the overall transportation budget, it's the only part where there is that sort of flexibility to do land use related things, to put these other sorts of criteria in. So that's why, I think in this case, actually, the flexibility to go beyond standard, maintenance type things is actually justifiable from a policy basis. In terms of standard mainstream gas tax revenues, I agree with the person who's written in that the emphasis needs to be on maintaining what we have, particularly when we're not taking care of that before building a whole lot of new things. Roger.
Metro was recently right in the middle of a controversy that pitted freight and business interests against quality of life up on dealing with the St. John's Bridge. And I was just wondering if you could comment about that a little bit and maybe about what role you see Metro playing in trying to resolve those kind of conflicts.
Well, the issue on the St. John's Bridge was that ODOT, which is the owner of the St. John's Bridge, was doing some rehabilitation of the bridge. I think procedurally, probably was a case where there probably wasn't sufficient public involvement in involvement of the regional government and localities in terms of how the project was scoped. My own personal view is that is a very important freight corridor connecting Rivergate and the Northwest Industrial area. So my personal view is that that needs to be the priority there in terms of having bike access and pedestrian access. I think that's a very valid thing. That's a good thing there. But in terms of reducing access for trucks, I personally, and Rex and I probably have differing opinions about this. I mean, we agree on 90% of the time. But I think the outcome wasn't necessarily wrong in this case, but I think probably it wasn't handled very well in terms of the relationship between ODOT and kind of regional objectives. So. Lavinia?
David, what do you think is the prospect for increasing funding for transportation demand management strategies from the MTIP pot?
Trying to handicap what, something coming out of the MTIP pot, it's kind of early to say. I don't know. I know that transportation demand management gets a lot of support across the board from people who don't necessarily agree on modal things some of the time, because it's a fairly effective dollar spent. What I mean by that is, I hear people who I would normally hear at JPACT advocating for highway expansion are also now talking about demand management, because they're seeing that they're not going to have the huge pots of money that they might have dreamed they could have for the road expansion, and that recognizing that a dollar spent on demand management actually does create some capacity. Meantime, people who aren't necessarily enamored of roads also are supportive of demand management. So I think it's it's one of those things that has more sort of ecumenical support, or whatever you'd say, than certain other things. So I think from that standpoint, the prospects are pretty good. But in terms of the MTIP, it's hard to say. I don't know. The 150% cut list is coming out in a couple of weeks, so where that gets weighed, I'm not sure yet. Professor?
I have a question about the I-5 partnership effort that was recently completed, at least a major phase of it. One goal of that was to deal with sort of the trade issues of freight moving along the I-5 corridor. And I guess I have a two-part question. Is one, whether you think that the trade issue and the freight and sort of the economic development aspects of that, if that really was addressed in what the group came up with in terms of recommendations, and then also where you see that headed. I mean, or in terms of funding, a second bridge, or some of the outcomes.
Well, I think freight mobility is often the pretext for a lot of discussion, particularly on the I-5 corridor. But the proof to me is when the investments are made, particularly if it's an investment that expands the road capacity, are there also steps that are being taken that preserve that capacity in some way or another for the freight that was the original pretext for the investment in the first place. My concern with these always is that the road expansion happens being justified on the basis of the need for freight, but then single occupancy cars are able to, they soak up the capacity right away, and the situation for freight really doesn't improve. I'm not familiar enough with the recommendations in this particular case to know what the safeguards are and if that's going to be addressed or not. But I think, as a general case, I would watch that really closely.
As a follow-up, then, do you think that we should be looking at, for example, truck-only lanes, and particularly truck-only toll lanes, sort of the hot lane concept, but applied to trucks?
Yeah, no, I do. I think that a premium for freight, that does it. You needed to run the economics on it, but I think it does pencil out for some commodities at certain times of the day, and that's a reasonable economic sort of tool to use to basically ration capacity, because there's no way to build all the capacity that some people might want to have built. So, using truck tolls to do that, I think, is a good approach. Morgan.
We've all learned about the history of the automobile and how, transit and streetcars and trolleys, people have moved out of those into the automobile over the last decades. And the same thing seems to have happened from train. Freight has moved out away from trains and towards trucks, and taking for granted we know the answer to the reasons why. What do you see the future of freight trains? Is it growing? Is it going to dwindle further? And specifically, in Europe, they have high-speed train tracks for passengers as well as freight. Electric, so more environmentally friendly, you might say. Electric trains. Is that a future that we in this region want to try to promote, or that we might see a growth in use of freight trains?
Well, let's talk about the freight industry and then passengers, because I think those are very different in terms of their operating characteristics, in terms of the engineering of the right-of-way. I mean, those are very different things. One of the advantages Europe has is, in many cases, they don't mix those two, because it's different sort of operating characteristics. In terms of the freight industry, there certainly has, over the last 40 or 50 years, there has been a big shift of the growth of the trucking industry, which has certain characteristics the railroads have never been able to match in terms of flexibility and delivery, site to site, gate to gate, and in terms of speed in most cases, and in terms of just handling, in terms of damages and that sort of thing. And I think things have settled sort of into what their roles are based on commodity and based on distance, both of those things being a function of the economics. Where rail is very strong and always will be very strong, and where they've continued to have success and growth, are the low-value bulk commodities like grain, chemicals, coal, items like that, where it's a low value, low urgency, and a lot of it moving from one point that's rail served to another point that's rail served. And they're going to continue to always be very strong because the economics favor rail, and they favor rail more the longer the distance is. So I think where their head-to-head competition with trucks is going to come is actually much more with, if you can't beat you, I will have you join me, which is the piggyback business, where over the longer distance, the trucking companies actually become a customer of the railroads and put trucking on flat car, so that either end of the operation is handled by the trucking company, which is their strength, whereas the line haul is handled by the railroad, which is their strength. And the economics of that is better for the overall user. So I see that as the future of the freight transportation area. From our point of view, this is a public policy issue, for a class like this or for a group like Metro, is tonnage figures about freight don't tell you very much about what the landscape should look like or what the facilities should look like. So when you talk about those figures of, well, this many tons moved by truck and this many tons moved by rail, they're completely different sorts of animals. That 10 trucks of, or 10 tons of FedEx packages moving around the Beaverton area on FedEx trucks that need to be there by 9, that's very different than 10 tons of wheat, going from Pendleton to Japan. You asked about the passenger side, and I think there's an underlying economics there, too, that's, of course, related to petroleum pricing and worldwide energy prices, which, times like this, I think this country starts to realize, maybe the rest of the world does know something that we don't know, particularly for those short distance trips. In corridors like Eugene, Portland, Seattle, rail really ought to have a strong advantage, and the higher the price of oil goes, the better the advantage for rail. And you look at the number of people, of landings and takeoffs at PDX that are just people going to and from Seattle. If that could even 10 or 20% of that could be diverted toward rail, it would have a big, very positive impact, I think, on both modes, actually. But the challenge in this country is the conflict between freight and passenger, which both parts of those, both the passenger system and the freight system, in a physical sense, are going in opposite directions in terms of the characteristics they need compared to rail operations 50 years ago. That passenger trains are getting lighter, freight trains are getting heavier. So they're getting farther apart in terms of the type of facility they need and the types of curves they can handle, the types of tractive power, and all of that sort of thing. So there's a couple models around the country, around the world, that Germany, Japan, France have basically set new right-of-way. Start from scratch, passenger-only right-of-way. The UK is much more the incremental sort of approach, which is try to make improvements to existing rights-of-way, though even in their case they don't have the freight interference that we have here. I think for it to develop in this country, it'll be more the UK type of approach that we would have to take, because the capital requirements for a new system over the distances that we have in this country are probably not something that we're likely to be able to swing. It's a little you read in the paper, $15 billion going to the airline industry this week without a whole lot of debate, no discussion. Well, $15 billion is about 15 years of operations for Amtrak. But it's a big, good discussion for them to have in Washington.
Amtrak makes a better lobby.
Yeah. But I think how capital gets spent on rail passenger, it's going to be in an incremental fashion. That's what's going on in the Portland-Seattle with the Talgo train, where they shave 5 minutes here and 10 minutes there and slowly are working it down so that now it's 3.5 hours between here and Seattle rather than 4 hours as it was. Well, it still ought to be 2.5, really. But to get there, probably get there 5 or 10 minutes at a time by incremental improvements. Be my guess. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about the need for industrial lands in this region and the the transportation system that requires that, and how do you go about it while keeping a very, as tight as you can, an urban growth boundary?
Sure. Industrial lands were a big part of the urban growth boundary decision that we made in December. We made a large biggest urban growth boundary expansion ever, and about 3,000 acres of what we did in December was specifically for industrial purposes. So there was some land on the east side around Gresham, a little bit around Oregon City, Tualatin, Hillsborough, elsewhere around the region. And that was in response to a study that showed that the region really is short of large lot industrial sites. And when I talk about that, it's not, and I think when most of the other Metro councilors talk about that, we're talking about real industry, manufacturing, warehousing, distribution. It might be a high-tech fab plant. It might be food processing plant. Things that really need to be more or less horizontal because of their process and the footprint that they occupy. In the past, particularly in the 90s, a lot of land that was zoned for industrial purposes was used for things other than true industry in that sense. There was a lot of sort of one-story or two-story sort of speculative office parks or retail, drive-ins, things like that, that were actually ended up getting sited on industrial land. So a lot of industrial land got used up for non-industrial purposes. In my opinion, a lot of those, we need to be driving those into more of the centers that we're talking about, the historic downtowns, whether it's downtown Portland or the Gateway area or downtown Hillsborough, for that matter, and making sure we're preserving industrial lands for true wealth-creating job opportunities in the industrial sector. So we put conditions actually on land that we brought into the urban growth boundary for industry and said, well, this needs to be preserved for those purposes. Don't go be putting a Burger King there or Costco or something like that, so that the next time the next Intel comes along, we're back in the same situation. Oh, we've used up all the industrial land. So we'll be making another decision in the next year or so in terms of adding more land to the urban growth boundary for industry, and I think we'll put similar sorts of conditions on it when we do. We'll also be looking at how industrial land actually gets used, so that if there's land in the urban growth boundary that's zoned for industry, what are the steps we're taking to make sure it is actually being used for industry? It's two parts. Yes?
Bragdon, I have a question that's related to that subject regarding the industrial lands. Can you fathom, for example, a case where maybe some restaurant uses could be permitted on these properties, for example, for employees to go to lunch or something like that?
Oh, yeah. And I think all the conditions, for the most part, whether it's industrial sanctuary language in the city of Portland or the conditions that we've put on industrial land, is that certainly, uses that are ancillary to the primary purpose are permitted. And that's why when you go down Yon Avenue in the God's Lake, there's a McDonald's there. Well, it was permitted, or there's Tubby's Deli's there. Well, it was permitted under those sorts of provisions. It's not an attraction in and of itself. It's there because it supports the primary functions. So definitely, yes.
I just have a question. The $53 million is going to be equally distributed between the 4 counties, or are there counties that don't have eligible projects, or they have different priorities?
Well, the $53 million in federal funds that we allocate through the MTIP is within our jurisdiction. So there aren't geographic requirements, and it's going to be more on sort of the merit of the projects. And I've really tried to push our council, and I think JPAC, into thinking less parochially about things and less about, well, I own this and you own that, and so money for this is good and money for that is bad, and get beyond sort of that sort of geographic parochialism and talk about what are the good projects wherever they are. So there's no fixed quota or geographic formula. This is the pot that's fairly flexible and has that flexibility. So
there is basically competition going on between the counties.
Yeah, so there's definitely competition about who's got the best project. Now, there are whole other pots of transportation money that are done by formula, whether it's formulas of road miles or lane miles or population or the other formulas that get used. But this particular pot of money doesn't have those sorts of of criteria. And a lot of the time, at the regional level, I think sometimes those labels, again, they really get in the way of making good policy, because the significance of facilities and their ownership are not all the same thing. And where something is located also doesn't necessarily, and who owns it doesn't necessarily relate to how significant it is. That's particularly true in the freight area. In past MTIP processes, for example, the improvements that, say, in access to Portland International Airport or Rivergate, in those who kind of keep score on this in a parochial sort of way, they would say, oh, well, that's a Portland project. Well, fact is, where would Washington County be if there weren't an airport in Portland in terms of the high-tech industry or freight access? So that, to me, that's the fact that that airport is located in Portland shouldn't count against, in a geographic sense, that, oh, that's a Portland project. That's really a regionally significant project. Similarly, the reverse would be true, too. If there's some very large employer that's going to come to Hillsborough as a result of some transportation, in part because of some transportation investment, well, the impact goes far beyond Hillsborough. We shouldn't say, oh, well, that's Hillsborough's money. That's really, all of our money if it benefits all of us. Yes, on this side.
Yeah, going back to the allocation of the funds and the freight versus quality of life issue, are there any national or international communities or models that Metro follows to solve those problems? Because I'm sure it's not unique to our area. Is there anything that we do to solve those problems using their examples of solutions, or is it pretty much just us trying to figure it out on our own?
Well, no, I think there are models. Certainly, there's some thriving places that have a lot of international Rotterdam or Hong Kong, that they have tremendous tonnage is moving through those communities, yet they're also, exciting places to be and ability to get around. So I'm not, but I'm not real familiar in terms of particular models that we've adapted here. Can be done, though. Morgan.
You mentioned the urban growth boundary expansions to provide more area for industrial uses, and the fact that there were other industrial lands that sort of got built up, perhaps not with the most efficient, use of that land. So I know that in the trying to accommodate new residents to the region or future population growth, there's sort of in the formula as expected that there's going to be some redevelopment of interior lands. Mm-hmm. Is that put into the mix with industrial lands? Is there some expectation? Because I assume these originally zoned areas were the prime locations next to highways and good transportation networks. They might have been eaten up by a Costco and a self-storage and a small industrial park. I mean, is there some expectation that the business is going to have to look at, redeveloping land and, demolition and then regrowth in order to plant a big box manufacturer?
Yeah, the redevelopment agenda, I think that's going to be the critical thing over the next 4 or 5 years, actually. We've spent a lot of time analyzing where to add land to the urban growth boundary and how to do that. And, people spend a lot of time and attention. How do you provide services to those? And I think what I'm hoping to see is a shift of emphasis, actually, to how do we overcome some of the obstacles to redevelopment and reuse of land. Because it's really going to be a fiscal imperative. Particularly for some communities. We look at the city of Milwaukee, that North Milwaukee industrial area, there's kind of the Southgate cinema and all that stuff in there. There's really kind of underutilized, yet there it is sitting there with some site consolidation and redevelopment that should be revived, kind of in my opinion. Yet there are obstacles to doing that. It's harder to do that than to just go farther out and clear a farmer's field and put up a warehouse there. So I think we as a society, both the local jurisdictions as well as Metro, need to be looking at things. And I think state of Maryland does some of this. Is, well, how do we make it easier to do the right thing, which is redevelopment, rather than just sort of let things take their course and things go farther and farther out. So definitely the redevelopment agenda, I think, is the big challenge. What else? Yep.
You know, a big topic of concern in attracting business has been the relative lack of industrial land, notwithstanding discussions about expanding the urban growth boundary, and also notwithstanding redevelopment. You know, there's other parts of the state that have a lot of land that are far away from Portland. We're just curious if Metro is partnering with other jurisdictions in Oregon, such as Umatilla County, Morrow County, Harney County, some of these areas that have been very job poor but land rich. Do you see any long-term potential as far as Portland partnering with other areas of the state and maybe strengthening our transportation links to Eastern Oregon, for example, and having Portland kind of be the way station, if you will, in terms of distributing, say, manufactured goods to the world economy and the national economy, and in other words, not relying on Portland necessarily to receive all the new jobs in manufacturing?
Well, we're not a development agency ourselves directly, but for those who are, whether it's Portland Development Commission or the state government, or to some extent the Port of Portland, I think there has been some discussion of that with really sort of mixed results, and there are a couple of lessons from that, I think. One is that raw land supply in and of itself is perhaps not the most important factor. And, you know, and if you look around the world, you know, just sort of in colloquial terms, well, that's true. I mean, look at, you know, if that were the case, then Russia would be a very, very prosperous country, and the Netherlands would be poor, or Singapore would be poor. So it's not just about having raw land supply. It's about having access to markets, including access to a great labor force, for example. So I think what people find is that just cheap raw land maybe is overrated in some people's minds in terms of it as an economic development factor, and that there are other factors in terms of industrial recruitment or retention that are more important, such as good transportation, labor supply, other factors in the business climate. So just selling ourselves on being cheap, you know, that's not a good long-run strategy, because it's not one that we can win for very long. And I think what they found was sort of mixed results, is that, for example, in the high-tech industry, during the boom time of the 1990s, that would often get raised. Well, gosh, things are so tight in Portland. Boy, wouldn't it be great if Intel would go to Coos Bay, or, you know, their next plant would be in Burns or wherever it might be. And what those sorts of clients would say, that doesn't work for them, because they want to be near other people who are like them in terms of the labor force, in terms of shared information and technology. They want to be near higher education. They want to be in a place where their employees can go to the opera and the other things that their employees like to do. So in those sort of settings, I don't think there was success there. For other industrial sectors where there is some competitive advantage in the rural areas, there has been success. And the crossroads of I-84 and I-82 at Umatilla is one of those, where they have been successful because they have some natural strengths. So the Walmart warehouse, for example, so Walmart services the entire Northwest out of Umatilla because it's centrally located for their stores. They can hit Boise and Pocatello, Spokane, Seattle, Vancouver, Portland, Eugene, all out of Umatilla. So for their purposes, that was good, and the fact that land was cheaper there than here, you know, helped drive them to that decision. There's another one of those, I think, Targets down in Lebanon, Oregon, you know, for similar reasons. But it's really the underlying economics of distributing their product over the area that they're talking about that sent them there. It wasn't the state that said, well, you really ought to be in Lebanon or Umatilla. It was kind of the underlying locational decisions that those companies made, specifically for warehousing and distribution. So I don't see that government can really drive a whole lot of the other industries to other areas without those underlying, you know, economic strengths. Gene.
The Metro Council in the past year made some very specific choices about how the federal funds will be allocated. So that's what you talked about with
Right.
the, job growth, economic growth. as the list is, being sort of sifted through, there are projects that rise to the top and projects that, fall to the bottom. Those projects that are at the bottom are still in need, and whether they be a maintenance need, like the email question that came in, whether they be a community desire, want, wish, vision sort of a project. Knowing now that, back in Washington, the debate and discussion is going to happen about what the next package will look like. And are there elements that, as a region or even you personally, might want to see come out of that new package that might be able to allow us to stretch a little bit more than just the criteria that you're basing your decision on at this point?
Well, I think we definitely want to continue in the direction, of more flexibility, the ability to use those federal funds with more discretion on our part. Kind of the direction we've been going over the last 2 cycles at Metro. I think that the current council is very supportive of that and would like to kind of keep moving in that direction more so. So in our communications back in Washington, that's, I think, what we've been saying is that we want that discretion. Now, then that puts the burden on us to exercise that discretion with wisdom in ways that support kind of the regional vision here in terms of livable communities and economic development. And frankly, we haven't done that in past rounds. I think we did a better job in the last round than the previous one. I think the previous ones, frankly, I'm not sure the outcome of how we spent MTIP dollars in '99 differed a whole lot in the outcome compared to how Houston or Phoenix would have done it, frankly, despite all our talk to the contrary. And I think by changing the criteria this time, I'm hopeful that we'll also change the outcome because it's changed the nature of the applications. Maybe we also have a stronger council than we did 4 years ago to back some of that up. Yes.
On a more personal note, what most important lesson did you learn driving taxi, and would you recommend it to other public officials?
Well, the question was, my first year on the council, back in '99, this was before I was presiding officer of the council, which is a full-time job. I mean, they're all full-time jobs, really, but not paid full-time. So I had to do something else to make some money for that year and drove a cab on the weekends. So basically Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and probably, which is something I had always wanted to do. I mean, I've just always been interested in that. And I think I probably, in terms of, bigger lessons were sociological rather than transportation related. Though, I mean, from a transportation point of view, I mean, I probably know more about how to get around this region than any other elected official. And, when I look at the MTIP, I can picture all of the intersections that are on the, in a way that nobody else can. So that really, there is that practical thing, I think. But the biggest lesson for me personally was much more sociological. And the interesting thing that struck me was the lives of people who are living in poverty, which is ironic. Because, I thought when I started, that only wealthy people take cabs. And in fact, it's actually the reverse for the most part, at least in Portland. Now, this is probably, I was accustomed to think about New York, where wealthy people take cabs and everybody else takes transit. Well, here, where you can't take transit everywhere, the people who take cabs for the most part in Portland are people who don't have cars. And a lot of the time, it's people who don't have cars because they're poor, or they've had a substance abuse issue, they had a DUI, or they had a repo, uninsured. So it's people who are down and out. So ironically, of course, which is, this is, nickel-dimed in America, it's people who are least able to afford it are using the most expensive form of transportation. For a similar reason, that they're using laundromats because they can't afford to buy a washer and dryer, so they're spending $350 to do a load of laundry rather than the fraction of that those of us who have washers and dryers. But, they're not on the ladder. They're living in motels at, $30 a day because they can't get the security deposit together to live in an apartment, which on a per-day basis is cheaper. So that was the prolonged exposure to people who are really down and out, and the different stories that they bring to why they're down and out was the biggest lesson for me. And for each one, it's a different story. For somebody, it's illiteracy. For somebody else, it's domestic abuse. For somebody else, it's alcohol. But so I think the lesson for me was not, how to get from 39th and Hawthorne to 42nd and Sandy in the fastest way possible. Though that's a good lesson too. The lesson to me was just sort of empathy with fellow citizens. Roger.
I wonder if you could just comment on that. Despite the criteria that Metro has for this round of funding, it still looked like most of the projects that came in were road modernization, both in terms of cost, because they tend to be expensive, but also the largest number. I just wonder if you can comment on that.
Well, I think there's probably some jurisdictions or some people that are needing to get used to the new criteria, or want to test it and see are we serious about it. And historically, that pot of money has been used for a lot of those sorts of projects. And so I think the onus is on us now to show that the new criteria that we are serious about that. It does relate to community development and livability and true job growth, rather than just whatever's on your list today that you couldn't fund through the gas tax. Well, then you might as well come try to get MTIP money for it because it's quote your turn or that sort of thing. So proof's going to be how we do it. But you're right. I mean, the application. I mean, I think looking at there's some jurisdictions that say, well, initially, of course, everybody in the business initially was, oh, you're changing it can't be done. Then you could see there were some jurisdictions that were like, oh yeah, that could be really good for us. Oh, you mean you could have then take for example Gresham. I think initially they said, now wait a minute, why are you changing? And then we have some meetings and say, well, remember what you're trying to do with historic downtown Gresham? This new criteria is actually good for you for that. Oh yeah, no you mean it could help us do that? So then the light bulb goes on, and you see some applications that are really responsive to that, because you get the transportation people talking to the planners and the kind of community development people who look at this as, oh yeah, we could score some points, literally score some points with this, our kind of stuff. There are other jurisdictions that frankly didn't say, well, let's dust off the list from 99 and submit it again.
So just to follow up on that a bit, do you anticipate that the current process will still work then, where it goes through TPAC and then JPAC, and then finally it gets to Metro, even though that Metro is obviously involved in the earlier rounds? Are you concerned that you're going to have a list, 100% list approved by JPAC that still has a lot of road mod on it?
My concern would be that that doesn't live up to the criteria. So that it was very important for me that last year we signaled our intent by adopting those criteria. Now, the criteria probably didn't go as far as I would have liked or other councilors would have liked. I think it's still, it's a long march. But I hope that by signaling that that we've sent, that the outcome will be different than what you described. I think there's still a danger of that, definitely. It's going to take, some fortitude on our part. And I think to our advantage in this is that we have 3 really strong Metro councilors on JPAC now who are going to stand up for those principles. And now that has not been the case in the past. And I made those appointments very intentionally, that we got 3 individuals, including the chair, who are just going to be, and in terms of the chair, he's just going to be holding people accountable for the process that we all agreed on. Not allow the backsliding kind of, and the others, I think going to be asserting the principles. So change is slow, but it's in the wind. What else? Yes.
Last question.
Last one.
No pressure.
Make it good.
This actually relates a little bit to something earlier, but I'm curious. Portland region and Metro in particular are seen as such leaders in the country and sometimes beyond this country. But we're in transportation, especially melding transportation and land use policy. Would you say that Metro and the Portland region take their inspiration from models from other regions, kind of directly from models from other regions in this country or abroad, or more synthesize examples from other places, or are really coming up with just kind of new policy and really new, almost inventions of policy?
I think we've been too insular and probably rested on our press clippings and laurels a little bit too much, actually, Frank. I think we could learn a lot more from other places than we actually do, particularly in terms of the relationship between infrastructure investment and planning and land use. Our system, was one of the first ones very early on, early 1970s, very much a legalistic and regulatory one that is separate from investment decisions. And so I think the Maryland model is very intriguing to me, where actual investment decisions are being tied to land use decisions, or they're tied to each other, rather. I think in this state, or at least in this region, a lot of the time we had land use plans that were, from a regulatory point of view, we're trying to constrain sprawl, both through zoning and the urban growth boundary, laudably so, and those are very good. Those are important. Those are indispensable tools. Yet at the same time, the fiscal tools were continuing to fuel the same old way of doing things. So while on the regulatory side, land use side, we're trying to constrain sprawl, on the fiscal side, we're still feeding it in terms of transportation investments and in terms of what gets subsidized or what doesn't get subsidized. So I think the real thing we need to learn from other places, and Maryland's the example of this, is trying to use the fiscal tools as well as the regulatory ones.
Before we thank our speaker, I just want to remind you that next week we have Michael Schiffer, who's the Vice President for Planning and Development of the Chicago Transit Authority, who will be speaking here in this room. So hope to see you then. And Mr. Bragdon, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.